With the success of the mid to long range gun cannon, the Federation now set their sights on creating a mobile suit that was meant for mid to close range combat. Or in other words, a machine that would not only rival the famous Zaku, but would surpass it in all areas. And in order to achieve this, the Federation poured all of their technical know-how and all available resources in the development and creation of a machine that would become famous for years to come: the Gundam. A situation that was without a doubt extremely stressful for the people working on it, so they probably should have tried out today's partner YoursApp, the ever-expanding Swiss Army knife of self-care apps. You can manage your stress and anxiety through meditation or yoga classes, chill out with their vast library of music, which includes lo-fi, ambient sounds, nature sounds, binaural beats, and more. They've got a section for psychological advice, and if you have trouble sleeping, you might want to give their sleep stories a shot. There's countless studies on the importance of sleep, and there's really no better start of the day than a good night's rest. Or end of the day, depending on how you look at it. And unfortunately, that's not something coffee can replace, no matter how much I want to believe it. So if you want to try YoursApp too, you can download the app for free right now with the link down below, and by using that link or my code Kakarot, you'll also get a 60% discount on a yearly premium plan. But back to the Gundam now. This famous machine would first see the light of day as the RX-78-1, now commonly known as the prototype Gundam. The machine that would introduce two features now commonly associated with the Gundam types: a V-shaped communications antenna and a compound-type dual eye sensor. The most common story is that the first two units were rolled out at about the same time in Jaburo, and that the only difference between the two was their color. Unit 1 was the black, white, and red color scheme that we now typically associate with the RX-78-1, whereas Unit 2 was painted white, silver, and red, often referred to as the rollout color scheme. In recent years though, it has been discovered that Unit 1 had a slightly different head when it was rolled out and first participated in test flights, and because of this, this version has now been dubbed the prototype version rollout version. And when you look at this picture of that first test flight, you might notice another weird thing. Rather than holding a beam rifle, it's holding onto a Zaku machine gun. And there was a very good reason for that. Despite being known as the first machine that was successfully able to use a beam rifle, this path was not without difficulty. Even though the generator met the requirements for the beam rifle's output on paper, in practice, the output wasn't stable enough, leading to several issues. And since we're on the topic of the beam rifle, this wasn't the finalized version either. Instead, the beam rifle used by the RX-78-1s was the XBR M7904G beam rifle, also known as the Hunch shotgun. During the Gundam's development, this beam rifle was originally meant to be mounted onto the arms, but this plan was dropped at a later date, which would also explain the indentations on the arms that are no longer present on the later versions of the Gundam. Instead, they went with the traditional handheld route and installed a holster for the beam rifle on the Gundam's side skirt. Its other main weapons then were a pair of 60mm Vulcan guns and two beam sabers. Weapons that have since become staples for not just Gundam types, but for almost all Federation mobile suits. Shortly after the 3-day test in space then, Unit 1 would be brought back to Earth, had its face upgraded to be the same as Unit 2, and began testing with the FFX-5 prototype core fighter. Because, just as the previous Operation V machines, the Gundams were designed to use a core fighter as their cockpits, but it would seem that at this point, the core fighters that were in use weren't yet standardized. So, based on the individual core fighters from the gun tanks and the gun cannons, the Hervik company set out to create the core fighter that would then be used by all Operation V machines. In total, 19 tests would be conducted with 2 prototype core fighters over the South American desert, and these included testing its viability as a standalone fighter plane, ejecting from the Gundam, and most challenging of all, mid-air docking with the Gundam. Something that was attempted during the first test run, but with mixed results. The core fighter was able to dock with the Gundams' legs, but it wasn't able to dock with the torso before reaching the altitude limit. This then forced the core fighter to separate again and abandon the Gundam parts. Fortunately, they safely made it back to Earth thanks to the attached parachutes, and 5 days later they could again try the test. And this time, the core fighter was able to completely dock with the Gundam right before they met the altitude limit. The next 17 tests then, over the following days, would give the Federation and Hervik valuable information for the finalized FFX-7 core fighter. It was determined that a new engine was necessary to provide more power for a safe ejection, the wings were changed, and it was now also outfitted with weapons. After these tests then, Unit 1 would continue to operate as the core fighter of Gundam Unit 1 and would also be upgraded to an FFX-7. What happened to the second prototype core fighter isn't known, but it's likely that it was upgraded to an FFX-7 too, and then either served as the core fighter for Gundam Unit 2 or was used for further testing. The 2 RX-78 ones then would be shipped to Site 7 for further testing themselves, and shortly after arriving, Unit 1's color was changed to a tricolor color scheme that was very close to the tricolor color scheme that has now become famous on the RX-78 too. It used white as a base color with red and blue accents. Unit 2 then was also painted in this same color scheme, but instead of using blue, red was again used. How this color scheme looked exactly is up in the air at the moment, because no confirmed images exist of either Unit 1 or Unit 2 from around this time. The only thing we do have is this image of the RX-78-1's manual, which shows us a model of what is supposedly Unit 2, sporting a tricolor color scheme that is somewhat different from the famous later one. And while it does still uses blue, maybe the red on the color is the color change that was mentioned earlier, which then means that Unit 1 was painted like this, but with a blue color instead. And while all of this was happening with the 2 RX-78-1s, the third RX-78 Gundam was completed in Jaburo, commonly referred to as simply Unit 3 or the G3. This unit is also considered to be the last Gundam of the first batch, and thanks to the test data of the first 2 Gundams, the G3 specs surpassed those of the RX-78-1, and it was instead labeled as the very first RX-78-2, a type that would become the basis for a great many Federation mobile suits and also support craft. The ankles no longer had the slits, the knee armor was made longer, the skirt armor was remodeled and the side skirts could no longer hold the beam rifle, the lower arms were changed, and extra armor was added to the backpack. In terms of weapons then, it kept the 60mm Vulcan guns, but its beam sabers were upgraded with a different type that would later on also be able to turn into a beam javelin, and it now used the famous BOA XBR M7907G beam rifle. With an output of 1.9 megawatts, its output rivaled that of contemporary battleships, and was able to destroy a Zaku with a single shot. This, in combination with an ammo capacity of about 15 shots, and incredible accuracy that was granted by a movable sensor that could work in conjunction with the Gundam's own sensors, was what made this beast the Gundam's most famous and infamous weapon, depending whose side you were on. As for the color scheme, on its rollout, it sported the same tricolor color scheme as Unit 1. So again, we're not entirely sure what its color scheme was exactly. But we do know that once Unit 3 was shipped to Site 7 as well, that it was changed to the now famous tricolor color scheme. And in the meantime, with the data of Unit 3, Unit 1 and 2 were upgraded to RX-72s, including having their armor upgraded to match Unit 3. At the time of the upgrade then, both Unit 1 and 2 still kept their original color schemes, But a little while later, as I just mentioned, all 3 units would get a unified tricolor color scheme, the one that would be the de facto color scheme of the RX-78 too. After this then, the Wide Base, the Federation's most advanced warship that was specifically designed to handle mobile suits, was tasked to sail to Site 7, pick up the Gundams and the other Operation V machines that were undergoing tests there, and bring them back to Jaburo for their final evaluation. Unfortunately, the Wide Base was followed, and before the mobile suits could be readied for combat, the trailing Zeon forces launched an attack on the colony. An event that would have an important impact on the development history of the Gundam. During the attack, a different fate befell each of the 3 RX-78 Gundams. Unit 1 was unfortunately never mentioned again after the attack, meaning that it was most likely destroyed during the attack. Unit 2 was mostly unharmed and would be pressed into service, something that would then lead to a variety of optional parts and support craft being developed for it, which are things that will be discussed in a future video. What we will discuss now then is a special feature that the pilot of Unit 2 was involuntarily forced to test out. Despite the unexpected turn of events, the Wide Base with the units on board that could be recovered began their journey to Jaburo. And for this, they would need to undergo atmospheric re-entry. Unfortunately, right before they were about to do so, they were again attacked by Zeon forces, and during the ensuing battle, Gundam Unit 2 found itself being pulled down to Earth. And this would have been a death sentence for any other mobile suit, but the Gundams were outfitted with a special cooling system that did allow them to successfully make an atmospheric re-entry all by themselves. Also, this system was already present on the RX-78 once. And then finally, Unit 3 was somewhere in between. It wasn't a total loss, but it was too damaged to be repaired in the field, so instead, it would serve as spare parts for Unit 2 on board of the Wide Base. As for what happened next, we have 2 theories. According to one, Unit 3 was dropped off at the Augusta Research Institute at around the time of Operation Odessa. Here, it would be extensively researched and upgraded, with much of its data also being used on the development of the Gundam NT-1, also known as the Alex. Unit 3 would then eventually be brought back to space to participate in Operation Star 1, the Federation's attack on Abawa Q. According to the second theory then, Unit 3 was dropped off much earlier when the Wide Base first docked at Luna 2, which was shortly after that Zeon attack on Site 7. Here it would then be researched and tested, and would eventually participate in Operation Star 1, the point where the 2 theories converge again. Personally, I think a combination of both theories makes the most sense. Unit 3 is dropped off at the Augusta base first, where it receives a first round of upgrades, which then make their way to the development of the Alex, and then it is transferred to Luna 2 to optimize it for space combat in preparation of Operation Star 1. But whatever the case might be, the main upgrades done to Unit 3 consist of new and stronger thrusters, a more powerful laser accelerator for the generator, a new model of the learning computer, and most important of all, the magnet coating. A newly developed coating by Dr. Mosk Han that could be applied to the joints of a mobile suit. The theory behind this new coating was that by magnetizing the joints, any friction could be eliminated, which then resulted in a 20 to 30% increase in agility. And in combination with the upgraded thrusters and reactor, this pushed Unit 3 well beyond the specifications of the RX-78 too, leading it to be reclassified as the RX-78-3 Gundam. Visually speaking though, the general consensus is that the unit remained unchanged, but there have been some musings that, in order to apply the magnet coating, the joints were altered slightly. And since we're on the topic of visuals, Unit 3 is typically thought of as having a gray color scheme, which was an experimental low visibility color scheme. But as I've mentioned earlier, it didn't start out like this. we know that it had a different rollout color scheme, and that we always see the gray Unit 3 listed as the RX-78, which would then suggest that it only got that gray color scheme at the time that it was upgraded to the RX-73 spec. But when we look at the manual for the 2.0 Master Grade, trials with the low visibility color scheme were apparently already happening at Site 7. So it could have gotten that gray color scheme shortly after all 3 units were painted in the tricolor color scheme. The other big difference then was that it received a new and upgraded version of the learning computer that was in use by at least Unit 2. This was a system that was basically an extremely high-performance computer that would analyze combat data and would apply the results to the Gundam's programming, allowing it to better deal with such situations in the future. It was so powerful even that after sufficient learning, it wouldn't just be able to automate certain processes during battle, but even fight on full-on autopilot. Another important feature was that this data could then be extracted and applied to other machines. For example, future mass production machines, which is something that did end up happening. So to give the learning computer and its data as much survivability as possible, it was mounted inside of the core fighter. However, what we don't know is when this learning computer became a thing and by how many machines it was actually used. Since it was mounted in the core fighter, it could theoretically be used by the gun tank and the gun cannon, but we only see it mentioned as being equipped in Gundam Unit 2 after it was upgraded to the RX-72 spec, and in Gundam Unit 3 because we know that the latter's learning computer was upgraded. So it would seem that it was only a thing in the Gundams, although we don't know if Unit 1 had one, nor do we know if Unit 2's learning computer got upgraded. One reason for only the Gundams having the learning computer could be because the RX-78 spec had a dedicated coprocessor that was installed in the eyes to take some of the burden off of the learning computer. And then what we also don't know is what eventually happened to Unit 3. We can be certain that it did participate in the Battle of Abawa-Ku, but after this, accounts vary widely. They go from being shot down, to being damaged, to surviving the war, only to then be piloted by a Zeon spy and get disabled. So back to Unit 2 now. After the Battle of Solomon, it would also receive the upgrades done to Unit 3, basically turning it into an RX-78 itself. However, despite this, most sources would still label Unit 2 as an RX-78, with some adding the caveat that it was basically an RX-78. What happened to Unit 2 after this then is something that we should all be familiar with. Interestingly enough then, I also found a very different account of the first 3 units' development history, and this was in the master file on the RX-78 Gundams. The cool thing is that it not only offers a complete overview on a single page, but it also logically incorporates the Kotoki redesigns as upgrade paths. The downside though is that this does contradict the MSV history on quite some occasions, as you're about to find out. In this version, all 3 original Gundams start out as RX-78s, but Unit 1 is radically different. Not only was it sporting a very different white and red color scheme, but its legs were different, the skirt armor was very similar to what later on would be used for the GMs, and the antennas on the head were different. The reason for this though is that at the time, the final specifications for the RX-78 hadn't yet been finalized, and it wouldn't be until further testing and overhauling that we would get the RX-78 prototype Gundam that would lay the foundation for the next 2 RX-78 Gundams that would then be produced at the same time. However, even though they were all RX-78s, Unit 2 and 3 did have some upgrades from Unit 1. The ankle armor was changed, the chest armor slightly different, and the arms no longer had the indentations for the early plans with the beam rifle. After this then, several ground tests followed before the 3 units were transported to Luna 2. Here all 3 RX-78 ones would be upgraded to the RX-72 spec, the color scheme of Unit 2 was changed to the demo tricolor color scheme, and the color scheme of Unit 3 was changed to its trademark gray and white. For Unit 1, we unfortunately have no more images, but it would make sense that since it was upgraded to the RX-72 spec, that it was now identical to the 2 other units. They were then shipped to Site 7 where further testing happened, and where they eventually fell victim to Zeon's attack on the colony when the White Base came to pick them up. Again, what happened here to Unit 1 is unfortunately not mentioned, and it again just kind of vanishes from the records here. Unit 2 was again spared from major damage and was the only remaining functioning Gundam, and Unit 3 was too damaged to repair in the field, so would mainly serve as spare parts for the Gundam for the time being. Around the time then of Operation Odessa, the White Base would pass by the Augusta base, where they handed over the remains of Unit 3 to Dr. Moss Khan and his team, who would then work tirelessly to upgrade it in a variety of ways. It had more verniers and a new backpack, extra exhaust fans to deal with those, upgraded shoulders, a new type of beam saber, and most importantly the magnet coating. And all of these upgrades led to Unit 3 being reclassified as the RX-73 Gundam, or, as we know it, the version Katoki. Meanwhile though, Unit 2 would get another intermediary upgrade. After Operation Odessa came to a close, the White Base would go to Jaburo for debriefing, resupplying, and repairs. And for Unit 2, this meant getting upgraded space equipment and control systems. The Federation might not have had many operational mobile suits at the time, but this incremental upgrade was a sign of their cooperation to create the best mobile suits they could. The final upgrade then for Unit 2 was almost the same as in the mainline story. After the Battle of Solomon, it would be upgraded with the technology of Unit 3, essentially turning it into an RX-78-3, while still being called an RX-78-2. And of course, because in this course of events, Unit 3 was turned into a version Katoki, Unit 2 now also gets upgraded into a version Katoki. Personally, I do prefer the old school backstory that I described first in this video, but the way the master file includes the version Katoki as a logical upgrade path is also really cool, so I am definitely thinking about incorporating that into my personal headcanon. It also makes sense with how they describe that the various mobile suit teams were sharing information. At the time that Dr. Han got possession of the G3, the Jim Early type, the predecessor of the Jim C type, was already being deployed in space, so he could have derived some upgrades from it for use on the G3. Finally then, let's go over some of the weapons used by the Gundams. We already discussed the most famous ones, the 60mm Vulcans, beam sabers, and the 2 beam rifles, but over the course of the war, especially Unit 2 would be used to field test a variety of different weapons. The Super Napalm was a rarely used attachment for the beam rifle that was essentially an underslung grenade launcher that contained 4 napalm-filled rockets that could engulf a wide area in flames. At the moment, we only know that it was used the one time by Unit 2 to destroy the remaining Operation V parts on Site 7, so there's not a whole lot known about its effectiveness in actual combat. It's also possible that the Super Napalm was usable without being attached to the beam rifle. A more commonly used weapon then was the Blash XHB-L03/NSTD Hyper Bazooka. This rocket launcher held 5 rounds and was particularly useful against slower moving and heavily armored targets like battleships or bunkers. Rumor even has it that it was originally designed to also have the ability to fire nukes, but this plan was dropped early in development. And when not in use, it could be stored on the Gundam's backskirt. it would also see mass production and would be further developed, basically becoming the go-to weapon for Federation mobile suits that needed to pack some extra punch. The one thing about the Hyper Bazooka that's a bit muddy though is its caliber. The consensus is currently that it's 380mm, but you'll also find sources claiming that it's 270mm, 320mm, or even something as ridiculous as 700mm. That's roughly 1/3 the size of the mobile suit holding it. How? And talking about the more ridiculous weapons, the Gundam Hammer, which was simply an upscaled version of the medieval flail. It was designed for situations where neither beam weaponry nor the Hyper Bazooka could be used, and it did have the power to destroy a Zaku with a single well-placed hit. And while the Gundam Hammer didn't see widespread adoption, some of these weapons were making the rounds, and it was even upgraded to the Hyper Hammer. The spikes were made pointier, and it now also got thrusters to increase its momentum, something that would make it even harder to dodge and also gave it a harder impact. The one Hyper Hammer that we know saw action was destroyed and was never seen again. And last but not least, it used the RX-78-08/SO1025 shield for defensive purposes. Even though the Gundam itself was already made out of the strong Luna titanium alloy that could easily shrug off Zaku machine gun bullets and even Zaku bazooka rounds, it would nonetheless be an important asset. Other than serving as extra protection from weapons, it could also be used during atmospheric re-entry to redirect heat away from the Gundam itself, and according to some sources, the shield could be used to store the beam rifle and even 2 extra beam sabers. Typically, the shield was mounted onto the left arm, but it could also be mounted on the right arm or stored on the backpack. And that has been all for this condensed version of the development history of the first 3 RX-78 Gundams. I was expecting this to be long, but it was crazy to see how the script just kept on growing with every special feature that I remembered that I needed to talk about. At first I wanted this video to be about the first 8 RX-78s, but that idea quickly changed to the first 3 RX-78s and their variations, and then I had to further cut that down to just the first 3. And I still could have lumped more information in. But fear not, that was mostly technobabble stuff like the backpack's model number was RRM3C, and includes 2 built-in Takim NC5 sub-generators that provide power for the beam sabers. Although I must admit, I am considering doing a deep dive video on just the RX-78 too, because there's just a crazy amount of information available on it. For now though, I'm just going to leave you with the fact that it has an extendable microphone built into the head for spying on the enemy. Because nothing says sneaky like a giant 18-meter tall death machine that is painted in white, red, blue, and yellow. But anyways, don't forget to check out YoursApp with the link down below. As always, a big thank you to the Patreon supporters. I hope everyone watching has a great day, and I'll see you all next time.